Today's topic is RRL, Strategies for a Successful Deployment. So the format today is a new one for us. We're going to do an interactive question and answer session the entire time. And so I will be one of the presenters, and I happen to have with me one of my colleagues, Peter Losher, who is our Senior Operations Architect. So he's going to be able to provide us with some firsthand examples of deploying RRL based on his experience in deployment on ISC's resources. So we hope you'll get a lot out of that. So all of you are on mute, but we are going to take your questions during the webinar, which is also something that we're trying out for the first time. So if you have questions during the webinar, please use your WebEx chat window and submit them. We will answer all the ones that we can in a timely fashion. If we do not get to them during the webinar due to time, we will follow up with you via email. If you find that you have any questions after the webinar concludes, we'd be happy to entertain those. You can send those to info@isc.org. And we will be sending a recording of this event to all registered attendees so that you can refer back to it. You could also forward it along to others that you think may have interest in this topic. So about what we're going to talk about today, I'll give a brief overview of ISC and DNSCO. I'll give another brief overview of RRL itself. A lot of you attended the webinar we had back in August, which was a brief overview or a more basic overview of RRL than what we're going to dive into today. Today we're going to be talking about, again, ISC's experience in development and deployment of RRL. And we'll have a much more in-depth technical look at how you would deploy RRL. So in doing that, we'll also be talking about things like how you would utilize logging with RRL, things you should think about when you're contemplating deploying RRL, and then we'll talk about additional work that we're doing for RRL. So a little bit about myself. I have been with ISC for 3 years now. I've done lots of configuration audits, lots of consulting. I am one of the trainers for our DNS and bind course. I have also done a lot of support of our customers. And these days, I'm typically found on lots of sales calls as the technical representative. So as I mentioned, we also have Peter Losher here, who is our Senior Operations Architect, and we'll have Peter introduce himself just a little bit later as we get into talking about RRL's creation and what deployment looked like here at ISC. So most of you know ISC based on our public benefit work, and the one you most likely know about the most is our open source software development. So we are the authors and maintainers of bind and ISC DHCP, along with some other open source software. The other one that people know us for is we are one of the operators of one of the 13 root name servers. We operate F-Root. We also do some public benefit secondary DNS hosting for nonprofit organizations. We also have some sponsored research and development, our Open Home Gateway Forum, and open source routing. Many of you may be familiar with Quagga, and Quagga falls under our open source routing forum umbrella. And then there's DNSCO. DNSCO is how we provide commercial services to those that are using our open source software in mission critical environments. And in order to provide those professional services like support, training, consulting, there's an IRS requirement that we do that with a wholly owned subsidiary that is a for-profit entity, but again, it is a wholly owned subsidiary of ISC, and the funds from DNSCO flow back into funding development of bind and ISC DHCP. So, RRL overview. So those that were with us on the webinar in August, bear with me for a few minutes, but I'm going to take a few minutes just to do a quick review of a little bit about why RRL was needed and what has been done. So essentially, response rate limiting is an enhancement to the DNS. It is a way by which we can limit the number of unique responses that are being returned by a DNS server. And this is a very important point, that what we're limiting here is responses. So your name servers are still going to be taking in the same number of queries that they were taking in before. What RRL is doing is starting to change the behavior on how many responses or type of response that we are going to send back, based on what we view as malicious or improper behavior. And we'll talk about the details of that as we go on. So it is a mitigation tool for the problem of DNS amplification attacks, and is currently the only tool that is available for filtering within the name server itself. Tools that were available prior to RRL and are still in use are tools that typically take place either before you get to the name server, or sort of like IP filters on the server itself, but not within the name server software. RRL is included in Bind 994, which is the current release that is available on the ISC.org website for download. So let's take a little bit of a look at how traffic should operate. And since we're talking about DNS, we're going to talk about queries here. So our friend here at host 5.6.7.8 is green, everything is good. It sends a question out to some authoritative name servers on the internet, and it does so when it's behaving properly with a source IP address of its own, 5.6.7.8. So when that question reaches one of the authoritative name servers for the domain in which the question is being asked of, that authoritative name server will respond to 5.6.7.8 with the correct answer to this host query. So over here on the right, we have host 1.2.3.4, who's minding his own business and is not being disturbed by any of this traffic that 5.6.7.8 is generating. When we talk about a reflected denial of service attack, what we're talking about here is now we've got 5.6.7.8 has turned red, so something has happened on this host. It's either been compromised or it's just a host that a malicious party has in its control in some way. So now when it sends a query, what it starts to do is, instead of using the real source IP address, what it starts to do is say, I'm asking a query, and by the way, my source IP address is 1.2.3.4. Now this query goes out on the internet and again finds the authoritative name server for within which zone this question is being asked of, and that authoritative server sees it and it has no way to ensure that that question actually came from the host at 1.2.3.4. So what it does is it sends a response to 1.2.3.4, an unsolicited response. So in this visual, this isn't too bad of a thing. I mean, it's not good, but when we talk about distributed denial of service attacks, what we're talking about is hundreds or thousands of those red hosts sending these types of queries with spoof source addresses, which prompt responses to a victim in this case, with the intent of either severely degrading the service that 1.2.3.4 is providing, or completely taking that host off the internet for some period of time. So with that, I'd like to ask Peter Losher to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his role at ISC. Peter?
Thanks, Eddie. For those of you who don't know, my name is Peter Losher, and I'm the Senior Operations Architect here at ISC. I oversee all of ISC's operational DNS platforms, including f.rootservers.net, which is one of the 13 DNS root servers, and SNS at ISC, which is our secondary name server platform. I've been with ISC for over a decade now, which makes me one of the graybeards. And before that, I worked at Nominum as well as at NASA Ames.
Excellent. Good to have you here, Peter. Peter is actually listed in the RRL, in the acknowledgement section of the RRL technical document. And so, Peter, could you let us know a little bit about how RRL came about?
Sure. As you may know, ISC has been signing all of our zones using DNSSEC since 2006. Because of that, we started sending large DNS responses with the answer and a digital signature, which is called an RRSIG. As you can see, when you send a query to the ISC.org name servers that, let's say, for example, for isc.org/any, the query itself is about 36 bytes, but you get a response of about 3K back. So for just a little bit of investment, you can get a large, in this case, almost 100 times a rate of return on the investment. So if someone goes in and says that they want to attack someone just for a little bit of data, they can get a huge response back. So in our operations team, we started to see issues where people started to complain that ISC was either attacking them, they were seeing all these data flows coming in from our name servers, or folks were getting attacked from either an open recursive server or their ISP's caching server, where they saw the traffic was all isc.org/any. So it was pretty easy to determine at that point that it was because of malicious traffic. Either we had clients that were being compromised that were just sending a whole bunch of queries to us, or someone spoofing a particular IP address for an intended victim, where they just spoofed their IP address so they could send out the queries from someplace else, but then have the responses come back to the intended victim in this case. So, but to our name servers, this all looked like legitimate traffic. I mean, any queries are legitimate. They are normally not used very often, but they are a legitimate DNS query. So it's not a case of having to go in and just say, we will stop refusing to answer/any, because there's software out there that depends on those answers. Mm-hmm. So after doing some further analysis of the traffic that we were seeing, we noticed a pattern that we were seeing the vast majority of these queries coming from a handful of IP addresses. And it wasn't a case of an IP address doing once or twice or 3 times. It was a case of tens or hundreds of times asking the same question over and over, like in this particular case, isc.org/any. Okay. Now, for most recursive name servers, they usually have a cache, so you don't have to ask the authoritative name server over and over and over. So in those particular situations, you would assume that the servers would just take the information from the authoritative server, keep it in its cache for however long it's set to, until it's set to expire. In ISC.org's case, it's usually about 2 hours. So there's no reason to ask us over and over and over for the same answer. So, so from our perspective, it was a case of why aren't these answers being cached? Why do you keep asking us over and over? So why not just, when you ask me once, sure, I'll answer back. If you ask me twice, okay, the previous answer may have been dropped in transit or whatever. If you're asking us 3 or 4 or multiple times, we shouldn't have to answer you. So, so I discussed this idea with Paul Vixie, and after much hand-waving and scribbling on whiteboards, as one does, and then we fleshed out the idea in more detail. And then Paul went to Vernon to basically take what we came up with and turn it into code form. So the result of that is what you saw last year with the Red Barn patches. Okay. And so fortunately, a lot of that functionality has now made it into bind officially, and that's what we're using now.
Okay, excellent. And one of the things you mentioned there was judging a lot of this traffic to be malicious. And so it kind of leads me to a question of, is this traffic always malicious, or are there other cases where this may be quote-unquote accidental? What types of patterns have you seen in that regard?
So there are certain cases where it might actually be, to some people's minds, legitimate. As I said before, normally with a caching name server, or normally with a recursive name server, you usually have a cache, so you're not always querying the authoritative name server for a particular answer. But there are installations out there where they either don't cache or they flush their cache regularly and ignore TTLs because they always want to get the most up-to-date, I'm using air quotes, up-to-date information possible. So to them, it doesn't hurt because, well, the pain is being felt elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily affect them. It's just another query on the DNS, and you should be over-provisioned, so you should always be able to handle all the traffic that's coming your way.
Right.
So those are two cases where it may be quote-unquote legitimate traffic, although it's not usually standard practice. Then there's also the case of open recursive servers, where as we all know, there are hundreds, if not there are thousands, if not a couple million open recursive servers that have just been set up across the internet, probably for the most part, mostly unintentionally. Either it was just a default configuration that was set ages ago, and now we know that there are botnets out there that scan for open recursive servers and use those for amplification. So in those cases, they're just being abused, and that is definitely malicious, albeit perhaps accidental. Now, I should point out here that RRL is not a silver bullet, or a golden bullet for that matter. It's just it takes care of a particular symptom that's happening now. Anyone who has been on the internet for a long time, attacks morph into something else. So think of this as a particular vaccine, but the bug may morph itself into something else 6 months or 12 months down the line, and the vaccine may not be as effective as it was before. Okay. So this isn't a golden solution. This works now, but it may change down the road.
Gotcha. Understood. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the time frame of deployment on ISC resources of RRL?
So we deployed it on the authoritative name servers for ISC and SNS. This is back when we still had the original Red Barn packages, back in the spring of 2012. At the time, we didn't see a need to run this on the F-Root name server, partially because F-Root, because it's a DNS root server, we're very conservative in its in how we configure it. And back then, as I said before, it wasn't even officially part of bind. It was bind patches, albeit from Paul Vixie. So,
right,
to a certain extent. But in any case, it wasn't part of the official code base. So since we weren't being particularly affected on F, we decided to hold off for now. But we did deploy it on ISC.org and on SNS, and saw significant advantages of doing so.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, it's interesting to me that a couple of things, that it speaks to the need of RRL when we talk about people deploying this when it was still just in third-party patch form, and it's interesting to me that, as the authoritative name servers of ISC.org, you definitely saw that need. It's also interesting in the fact that we initially were going to include RRL as an official part of bind in the release 9.10, and because of the need that we were seeing, we went against one of our release policies, in that we released a key feature in a minor version of bind. So it was included in 9.9.4 just because of the demand. There are a lot of people that have processes and procedures where they can't apply third-party patches. And so,
but in this particular case, we got around that by, it's not on by default.
Correct.
So,
correct. Yes.
So if you still run the default, you still get the 9.9 as intended.
Correct. Correct.
So I should also point out here that we deployed it on F over the last couple of months, earlier this summer. It was for a variety of reasons. It wasn't necessarily because F was being attacked. One was actually because it was now in base, and just a part of general hygiene, so to speak, we just went ahead and rolled out 9.9.4, and thus we had the ability to just go ahead and turn on RRL. Okay. So it wasn't because of any necessarily an attack or anything like that. It was just general hygiene.
Okay.
But we did see some performance. We did see some interesting results in the traffic graphs that will be on the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, let's take a look at those. So I think I'll let you go through it, but I think the first one shows what one node was seen at some point.
So this is from one of our busy F-root nodes in Europe, in particular Amsterdam. So as you can see, we were at 60, basically spiking near 60 megabits, and a lot of this traffic was basically ./any. This has been going on for some time, but it's not as big of a rate of return, shall we say, versus ISC.org/any. But the root zone's been signed for the last couple of years, and it does provide a little bit of a punch. So, and there are, in theory, a lot more root name servers out in the internet than, say, a couple of ISC.org name servers.
Correct.
This is basically a drip in the ocean in regards to F-root as a whole, but it does make the point.
Okay.
So as you can see in the next graph, we implemented RRL, and you see the responses started tapering down and got to a more normal level. That continued on. For some of these, we see it basically after 6 hours. A lot of times it tends to be like a day or 2 days before we see any result, or at least any result in them stopping the attack.
Okay.
They'll continue. It's like, okay, this may be a momentary problem. It doesn't cost me anything to continue to send the query, so just let it run.
Okay.
But if they see that it's being ineffective, as you see in the next slide, then they'll eventually stop.
Okay.
Now, they'll start again. They'll start repeatedly because botnets grow, go away, come back. They'll try again just to see if no one's looking. See if the configuration's changed. It's just like scanning for SSH or scanning for open recursive name servers. So they'll try again. It doesn't go away forever.
Right,
but
right.
As long as they see that that we're not a good amplification target, then it usually goes away. So.
Okay. And it doesn't affect you as much when you have it implemented.
Yes.
Right. And one question that we get asked a lot is when you and you can take this example if you want to, but what types of resource impact did you see on your name server when you implemented RRL?
Mostly negligible. I mean, as I said before, I mean, we over-provision on our DNS servers for the most part, just as a general practice. So it's not like all of a sudden the memory footprint doubles or triples, or the system starts bogging down. Now, if you're running closer to the edge, saying you're running at 80% or 90% of capacity, this, depending on how you configure RRL, it may push you over the edge. Okay. But in most situations, I mean, I've talked to other people who have, or other DNS operators who have deployed RRL, just so I'm not the only data point. Okay. And they've all said it's mostly negligible. Like you can't really, there's very little of a performance impact, and the memory footprint in the grand scheme of things is usually very small. Now, there are some tunables that we'll go over in the RRL configuration that will impact that, but if you use the basic defaults, it shouldn't cause that much of an issue.
Okay, interesting. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what considerations you thought through when you were going to implement RRL on F-root and SNS.
So for the most part, as you'll see, there are several options that can be used as part of the RRL configuration. We mostly kept it, at ISC, we mostly subscribe by the keep it simple, stupid principle. So we try to limit the amount of knobs we're having to tune because there's always the inevitable side effects and so forth, or unintended consequences. So for the most part, we use the defaults except for a couple of variables. But some of the more important ones that I wanted to go over were basically the flip mechanism, basically how many UDP responses that we turn around and send as a truncated response. basically what RRL was doing is basically when you hit the threshold, it all of a sudden starts throwing truncated responses back. Because what it's trying to do is say, hey, stop using TCP or stop using UDP. Please retry again using TCP, because TCP is much more expensive. It's much more expensive for us, and it's much more expensive for the client. So in a lot of cases, they don't necessarily retry.
Okay.
So they just ignore it and move on to the next thing. Because they don't want to have to keep all that state in their TCP stack or IP stack and so on. So the default of that in mind is 2. So every other response that we send back is truncated.
Okay.
After they hit the threshold, I should mention. Now we'll go to another slide. There's been some contention whether or not that's a good default or a bad default, but we've stuck to our guns in that respect and left it at 2. The other 2 major variables are the window. The window is the number of seconds. It's basically the window of how often you have how long you have identical queries. So, like with the third point, it's the responses per second. So I say, okay, I want the default. So the default in bind is 5 responses per second. 5 responses over the default window, which is 15 seconds. Okay. So once I hit 5 responses over 15 seconds, then I start hitting the flip.
Okay.
So that's the easiest way to understand how RRL actually works. So for the last 2, both windows and responses per second, that's highly variable. You can go with the defaults. The defaults are a good first step, but you may find that you'll be tuning those. Okay. Just depending on the conditions. And there are other tunables per second. It's dependent on the name server that you run, because, like, say, even for myself, I run 2 sets of name server platforms. One is F-root, and most of the traffic that comes from a root server is referrals, not responses. Right. And as you'll see in the full configuration, there is a referral per second response. On the other hand, for SNS, we mostly give responses. So A records, MX records, quad A records. We give the referrals are in the grand scheme of things a much lower percentage than, say, a root server. Okay. So you'll be muddling with these variables depending on what your traffic patterns look like and what you normally serve. So
okay, excellent. Well, for all the engineers on the line, this is where we get to the really good part, and which, for me, it's always like, this all sounds really good, but can you show me what this really looks like in named.conf, please, sir?
Okay, we'll start with the three configuration options I gave before. So here's the rate limit stanza inside your named.conf. As I said before, we're basically using the defaults here, and so they're tunable, obviously, based on what your needs are. So as I said before, the flip is default to 2, so every other response is truncated with the TC1. The window is set to 15 seconds, and the responses per second are 5 over that window, so 5 responses over 15 seconds. Okay. So after that, we've got the other options, such as referrals per second, no data per second, NX domains per second, or errors per second. So depending on what your traffic levels are like and what zone types you normally serve, you may be changing those. Okay. As I said before, if you're a root server, you're mostly doing referrals. If you're same thing with if you're Aaron or Ripe or someone where you're doing a lot of in-outer ARPA reversals, you'll be sending referrals. Okay. Although, like say for us at ISC, we're an end user, so a lot of those reverse DNS queries are going to be answers instead, because they're going to be PTR responses. And then if you just want a big catch-all, there's the all dash per dash second, which is set to 20 by default. Okay. So all else fails, there's the big red knob you can turn. Okay. After that, we have a option I like to call it. if I had my druthers, I would have told the developers to actually call this dry run, but in this particular case, they called it something slightly more unique. Log only basically allows you to go ahead and simulate what these configurations would actually do. So it's a case of it'll log what it would do, but doesn't actually say send the truncated responses or anything like that. It'll act like RRL is not in place, but the logs will indicate otherwise. Okay. So you can sort of simulate what would happen if you did a particular configuration. So obviously that is set to no, but you can obviously set that to yes if you want to just try it out and just see what it would do, at least in the log form. Okay. And so after that, we've got the query per second scale. That's set to 250 queries per second. So that basically, if you're getting bombarded with ever-increasing traffic, it basically contracts the window scale tighter and tighter and tighter. So it's a way to sort of double down in case someone's really just being abusive. And then there's the exempt clients. So to a certain extent, I don't know why anyone would use this, but it may be a particular situation where you need to whitelist someone. Okay. As someone would likely say, well, I need it for my monitoring because, well, my monitoring might get trapped by it. My response would normally be, well, if your monitoring service is hammering your name server, asking the same question more than 3 times a second, I think you've got a problem with your monitoring setup. Yes. So, but in any case, we do give you the option, V4 and V6, obviously. Okay. Consider notation. So just in case you have that option. And last but not least, we have the prefix length. So we normally default to /24 for IPv4. And also 56 for /56 for IPv6. This is where, if you really wanted to abuse a name server instance, you could do so here, because obviously the speed that we have is sort of dependent on how granular RRL has to be. So if you're tracking, I'm using IPv4 as an example, if you're tracking down to the /32s, so a particular IP address, it just means bind has to keep that many more measurements and that many more baskets, as we like to call it, trying to keep that information for accounting purposes. So that's going to cause named to actually churn a little bit hotter, have to use more memory because it's having to keep it at such a granular level, okay, versus just doing a /24, which is, say, a VLAN. Okay. So,
speaking of memory usage, is there a way to limit? And I'm definitely setting you up for this next option. You thought you were done with the options, but is there a way to limit the amount of memory that RRL is going to take up?
So yes. So there's 2 options. There's the max table size. So you can set, so it's like 40 bytes, and then however much memory you want to add to it. So in this particular case, it's 20 meg. And then the minimum table size is just basically there to be pre-allocated, so it doesn't have to create it at startup. It's just a startup speed method. Okay. So yeah,
sounds good. So we get a lot of questions about the logging in RRL. I mean, in 2 ways. One is we get a lot of feedback, and I certainly agree with this, exactly what you were talking about. A lot of people have concern when they think about implementing something that, I mean, when we think about DNS, we're talking about questions are asked and questions are answered. And so a lot of people have some valid concern about implementing something that's going to change that model in some way. And so I like what you were saying about the dry run. And then there's also the issue of, are my logs going to be flooded by RRL logging?
So, yeah, Eddie's just serving me up softballs. So, in any case, we advise using Logfiles, especially to start out, because you don't know necessarily what the effects of implementing RRL is going to be. And for anyone who's ever done query query logging, especially if you do a high amount of traffic, that's going to cause you a little bit of pain. Because in the case of named, what it's having to do is every time you send a query, it has to write to a log file. So it has to open up a session with the disk, write to disk, close that session, go ahead and continue on. So so what we normally tell people is go ahead and start logging for RRL to start out, and then once you get comfortable with it, you can basically comment it out or whatever. If it causes you a performance impact, if you're overly provisioned and you have capacity galore, go ahead and continue to run it if you feel you have to. Okay. But what we also tell people to do is we tell them to set up a separate logging channel for this. That way, if they're logging, if you have like one log file, like say named.log, you will, depending on how much traffic you get, it will completely overwhelm. And you don't want to have to go through and grep out the changes and so forth and have to extract out that information. Just keep it to a separate channel. It'll write to a separate log file, and it'll keep everything sort of all in one place, and it'll keep your existing logging clean.
Okay, excellent. And, sir, could you please translate that into named.conf speak for me?
So in the next slide, there is a logging statement. This is what you can add. We have actually this should likely be reverse orientation, but we have a category. All the RRL logging is done via the category query errors. So we write it out to a channel called query error log, and then we define the channel you can see above. We give it a file name. We say how many versions we want to keep and how big we want the file to get before we move to the next version. So here it's 100 meg. And so to prevent the next question that Eddie will likely ask me, how long does that last? So in our particular case, if we're under heavy attack at the time, it could last as little as 15 to 30 minutes. So seven sessions will give me a couple of hours.
Okay.
So that just kind of tells you how voluminous the logs can get. But obviously, if you're seeing very little traffic, or you have to implement it, or your mileage may vary on how big these logs are. So you may want to keep 14 versions, and you may want to roll over every 50 megs.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So if you don't mind, Peter, would you let us know about some of the quote-unquote gotchas? So things that you need to consider when you're thinking about implementing RRL. And our recommendation is always to think about it before you need it. That's always a good thing because you'll make better decisions. And the first one there is, you alluded to it earlier, but our friends at the French Network and Information Security Agency released a report sort of questioning the default value of slip being 2. Would you address that, please, sir?
Okay. So yes, they did present a paper at the DNS OARC meeting in Phoenix back in October. So you can look at the DNS OARC website to see their findings. I'm going to, in our response to this is that a couple. They advocate that instead of doing a slip of 2, that you do a slip of 1, because what they are proposing is that implementing RRL will basically expose timing as such, so that attackers could go in and cache poison. So their theory is that if you implement RRL, it exposes you more to cache poisoning. So if you're sending a truncated response, then that gives me an extra time before they can go ahead and try to send a TCP connection that to go ahead and flood.
Right.
But what we've indicated is that it takes you at least several hours to cache poison a recursive name server, and even at the couple of hours or 6 hours that it takes, you're basically hammering the system at least 100 megabit. So if anyone's doing any sort of monitoring, seeing a 100 megabit spike is likely going to, or spike in traffic is likely going to make someone notice.
Yes.
So, so in that particular situation, yes, it's possible, but the conditions have to be just right for it. And we do know that RRL is not turned on by default. You have to turn it on, and so you just have to balance the risks. Yes. We firmly believe that RRL is necessary until such a point that everyone can just assign their zones with DNSSEC. Once DNSSEC happens, then a lot of this goes away to a large extent, because then you can validate that the answers you're getting back is correct, and you're not having to worry about cache poisoning. Cache poisoning, in theory, just goes away. So, there's a blog post, and there's a link for it in our references later in the slide deck, where my colleague Brian Connery actually goes through step by step the paper that was presented and why we decided to stay with the slip of 2 versus the slip of 1, and basically what slip 1 also does is basically forces all traffic then to become TCP.
Right. Okay. Excellent. You touched on this a little bit before. Could you expand maybe a little bit on whitelisting or monitoring issues, and also on that RRL can interrupt or slow down some legitimate queries?
So, as I said before, when we had the named.conf, the named.conf stanza example, there is a exempt clients, because you obviously don't want to tighten down your RRL checks to say to disallow legitimate queries, or say your monitoring setup, because you may have monitoring inside your network, you may have independent third-party monitoring, checking SLAs, and so forth. So what you do in that situation is you can go ahead and whitelist them just to make sure that they'll never be affected. And then the not responding to legitimate queries, that's just a case of tunables. Okay. So being able to look at your log files, just while we give what we think are broad defaults in regards to RRL, so if you just turn it on and use the default settings, we highly advise you to look at the log files, because your mileage may vary. Not every name server is the same. Not every name server is the same, and your requirements may be slightly different than, say, the defaults.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
Okay. Excellent.
And also reminder that this solution will only work for a certain period of time. The viruses will change. So once you install this will take care of the symptoms for now, but it's not going to last forever.
Correct. Correct. And I believe we've already seen some reports of some changing behavior.
One of the things that you've seen basically is that because of the botnets and because of the open recursive name servers, people are starting to throttle back. It's like, in this particular situation, it's like SSL knocking. When SSL knocking first started, you'd see one IP address just bang over and over and over with multiple usernames and multiple password types and so forth. While when people started sticking rate limiting on SSH, what did people start doing? They started throttling back. So they just had more IP addresses, just ask 1 a second or 2 a second to be under that threshold. But they still collect the data. They just have to do it from a wider base. What you're starting to see, what you've seen for some time here, is that what the botnets are doing, or the malicious intent, is they're just spreading the query load over a much wider space. So it's not just a handful of addresses. Okay. We're talking thousands of addresses. So think of it like a leaky water pipe. It just drip, 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 and eventually you see this pool on the ground or in the sink or whatever. It's just another way to get to the same endpoint.
Gotcha. So that's a really good segue actually into the work we're doing with RRL Classifier, because not only are the malicious parties evolving and adapting, we're trying to stay ahead of the curve as well. So just to give you a little information about the work we're doing with RRL Classifier, as a reminder, with RRL Basic, the filtering is done based on the destination address of the response. So the source of traffic is assumed to be forged in these cases, and is providing the address of whoever the victim is going to be. So the work we're doing in Classifier, and we expect this work is in progress, and we expect these to be released or included in releases in 2014. Is we're going to allow for filtering based on, or response rate limiting based on the name requested, or Q name. So this will allow for whitelisting things like, I can implement RRL, but any question that's asked of this Q name, for example, www.isc.org, do not apply response rate limiting to that. So this is one thing that's been requested a lot that we've heard from our customers. The other part is that this begins to, and I say begins because we're still very early on this part, but this begins to support possible expansion to the recursive use case. So as it stands right now, RRL is only recommended for authoritative servers. We have felt like with the recursive servers, you have some other tools at your disposal, as in, number one, we hope that you're not running open recursive servers, and that you're making use of ACLs to only do recursion for your known clients. But with the Q name work in Classifier, stay on the lookout for what we're going to do in terms of applying RRL to recursive servers. And then the other work that's in progress is limiting responses based on the size of the response. So as we've talked about, one of the unfortunate side effects of DNSSEC has been that the responses are much, much larger. You can ask a very small question and get back a very large response. And so with the Classifier work, there's another knob where you can tune based on, I'm going to begin rate limiting based on whatever the size of a certain unique response is. So we're very excited about this this work that's going on. And so actually we've gotten a question that has come in, and let me see. Jim is asking, how about the other side of the equation? If you see the bad request, automatically enforce rules to stop answering them based upon the question and the source IP, knowing it is forged. In other words, a blacklist. So I'll let Peter ponder that, but my first response is, I don't really know that it's forged. I'm suspecting that it's forged based on the behavior, but I don't know. I mean, so it's a good question. What do you think, Peter?
It's just dependent on whether or not you can identify that's actually forged. I mean, if someone is querying you over and over and over, how do you know if it's a forged address or versus a caching name server that doesn't respond? I mean, I guess in theory you could do a lookup on the reverse zone and see if it's obvious that it's like, say, a Comcast customer, or a residential cable customer, or something like that. But you don't know necessarily if it's being spoofed or it's someone who's already been infected. Mm-hmm. So that's the short answer. We don't have necessarily. You can go ahead and say blacklist at the firewall level on the name server, but not necessarily at, say, the name server level.
Yeah, and one of the things that also comes to my mind with the blacklisting is it's part of what RRL is trying to prevent is that you have a victim IP, and most likely that victim IP is being spoofed. So if I then create a blacklist, then suddenly once that attack stops happening, the victim still can't reach my name server to ask a question.
It's the ACL-H problem.
Right.
Yes, I blackballed you because of a problem you had. Either you spammed me or you sent me a whole bunch of floods, but those never age. They stick in someone's routing table ACL filter and they never go away. And,
right.
And then 5 years later, some new customer gets the IP block and they go, why can't I reach you?
Right. Yes.
So
we've all inherited rules that were not commented.
Yes, that's happened before.
Yeah, exactly. So one good question just came in from China Telecom, and that is, where can I find detailed configuration of RRL manuals as well as more detailed information? And so there is really good information in the Bind 9 ARM or Administrator Reference Manual. And so when you download Bind from the ISC website, that is in the doc directory in every release of Bind. And so we highly recommend referring to the response rate limiting section. And if I'm recalling it correctly, it's only like a page and a half or 2 pages. And so it's very detailed and very to the point. So I definitely would recommend taking a read of that.
And that would be in the 994 ARM.
Correct. Good catch, Peter. It would be in the Bind 994
or later.
ARM or later. And let's see. So, and another question also from China Telecom is how is RRL deployment done with any K.I.S.S?
Basically, for any K.I.S.S, we just run them on all the any K.I.S.S instances.
Okay.
There's no, say, load sharing. It's not like they're so. It depends on how the any K.I.S.S has been deployed, whether you're using something like BGP to announce your routes or OSPF. Is it a hash or so forth? So, like, say in a typical any K.I.S.S situation, you would be sending a single IP address would be hitting one particular name server over and over and over. It doesn't flip back and forth unless the server goes away.
Okay.
So we deploy. So in say F's case, we've deployed it across all of our name server instances. So in theory, if someone goes in and tries to use an amplification attack against one of our F-root name servers, it'll hit the threshold on, say, name server 1 until name server 1 goes away, either because of maintenance or whatever. It will go ahead and try NS2, and it'll be more available until it fills up its available bucket list. Okay. So yes, we don't do any sort of state sharing across any K.I.S.S clusters of this information, because you're usually running it so tightly because it's only a couple of queries or so forth, or 5 queries over a 15-minute window. They fill up very quickly. Okay. So it's yes, you get a brief window of availability and then it closes back up again.
Okay. That makes sense. So Jim from App River has another question, and let's see. Is there any good reason to answer the same question more than X times per second for a given source? Jim thinks never. Well, we have to define X first. But I mean, the point is valid. I mean, if you, in quote unquote normal DNS, as Peter was talking about earlier, a recursive server should be doing some caching. So, what say you, Peter?
Basically, as I said before in the slide, I said one time, sure. Second, the second time, okay, I'll answer again because either you weren't listening before, or the packet got dropped in transit, or wherever. But anything above 3 times, I go ahead and drop. But these views are my personal views and not those of my employer. So your mileage may vary. Which is what I'd say. So we give you the tunable. You can set it down to 1 if you want, but I wouldn't necessarily advise it.
Okay. So Peter mentioned some additional resources on RRL, and Brian Connery, one of our colleagues, wrote a really nice blog in response to the slip default. So that's a nice read. And also Paul Vixie wrote, Peter was alluding to the timing issues that were brought out in that report, and Paul wrote a really well thought out post on Circle ID about all this as well. So we highly recommend those. And so we're actually getting fairly close on time, but if you have further questions, please do submit them, and we'll do them if we get through these next couple of slides in time. If not, again, we'll follow up with you privately via email. So we also want to let you know that we are having a special training offer. I see several of our former training students, hello James from Kojiko, on the call. So we are often offering a special 10% discount on our advanced bind training class. We are holding one in February in Arlington, Virginia, and I'll point out that our colleague Alan Clegg actually created the slides, the named.com slides, and those are from the training material that we use in the advanced course. So you'll be receiving a coupon code when we email you the link to the recording of this webinar. And we also, as always, we want to hear from you. So we've been doing a customer survey that we've gotten some really good responses on, and so we want to know how you're using bind and how you're using DHCP in your network. And so if you take the user profile survey listed there on this slide, we will send you a free t-shirt, and it's a rather unique t-shirt. It's a named diner shirt. I'll let your imagination run away with what that might look like. But we're always interested in hearing from you and get a t-shirt out of it. So let's see, we have just a few more minutes, and so, also, I almost forgot. We do have a webinar survey as well, and so we'd like for you to take a moment and complete the survey that we're now displaying. Again, this was a new format type for us. For Peter and I think it's worked out really well, but we'd like to get your opinion on how it was listening to both of us and how it was with the question and answer format. So if you would take a moment and complete our survey about the webinar, and that'll help us as we do more of these in the future. We do have a DHCP 4.3 webinar coming up in December, and so you should be receiving some information about that one, and we'd like to have you on that one as well. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you got something out of it. It's been fun to prepare for this one and fun to do. Again, please fill out the survey for us, and we appreciate your time today or tonight, depending on where in the world you are. Thanks, everyone.